Restraint in the use of firepower is infinitely more valuable than the use of overwhelming decisive force against an enemy. And resolving indigenous political and social problems counts for as much as closing with and destroying insurgent field forces. And here we see that the ethos of combat, extensive mobility and firepower, is eschewed in a counterinsurgency for something that we have also heard much about in the last few months, a clear and hold strategy. But a clear and hold strategy presupposes that we have sufficient troop numbers and sufficient security forces to impose that. And I have to say, at least for the past couple of years, that even now, if we belatedly increased US troop size by 20 or 50,000 troops, even if magically in the next few months we could create an Iraqi security force up to its targeted level of 325,000, which we're a long way from now, even then I would argue, given the population size of Iraq at roughly 26 million, the optimal ratio of 20 security forces per thousand of population, which is probably a minimal figure, not even for an environment like Iraq, we're still short of those numbers today. The emphasis must therefore be, the emphasis in countering insurgency must always be on ensuring the security of the population in order to win popular allegiance. And this is a very simple reason. Once the population is secure, the argument goes in counterinsurgency, it will then feel emboldened to, feel comfortable, feel confident in providing intelligence on the insurgents to the security forces. And in such a process, the insurgency itself will wither as the insurgents are denied access to the population for the manpower, supplies, and intelligence that an insurgency must thrive on. So in sum then, countering insurgency entails a three-step process. Securing government base areas, what Andrew Krepanevich in his famous foreign policy article would have called the oil spot strategy, or what General Templer called securing the white areas. Progressively cauterizing the hardcore insurgent areas, isolating them while expanding government control. Second phase is separating the insurgents from the population, providing the population with precisely the safety and security that they need, not only to thrive, not only to rebuild their country, but also endowing in them the confidence in the ability of the authorities, whether it's US or coalition military forces or the Iraqi security forces, to do what citizens expect of the authorities and of all governments, to protect and to ensure their safety. And finally, the third stage involves eliminating the insurgent infrastructure. Unfortunately, even at this late date in Iraq, I don't think we've really achieved any of those three. And in fact, it's the inability to learn past lessons on insurgency that not only results in the successive reinvention of the counterinsurgency wheel, but has also frustrated the militaries of many countries throughout the world, including that, not least of the United States as well. And in a paper I wrote 2 years ago, I argued that this scenario has left the US military, perhaps with the honorable exception of the Marine Corps, in a sort of Groundhog Day scenario, just like the movie, if you may remember, with Bill Murray and Andy McDowell, where Bill Murray, until he actually had this epiphany, until he mended his wayward ways, was condemned to relive the same unedifying experiences over and over again. And that seems to be where we are today. And this, I think, actually is really the fundamental asymmetry of this type of conflict. Because whereas on the one hand, conventional militaries often have profound difficulties in learning the lessons, in absorbing the best practices of past counterinsurgencies, on the other hand, insurgents and terrorists learn lessons not only from their own experiences, but from the experiences of other terrorists and insurgents extremely well. They study not only their own mistakes, but also the successful operations of their enemy. And they adapt and adjust in such a way as to be able to overcome even the most consequential countermeasures. They have to. For them, this lessons learned isn't only a means of ensuring successful future insurgent or terrorist operations. It's the absolute basis of how they can ensure their survivability, of how they can promote their viability, of how they can continue to regenerate and reconstitute their ranks, even after the tactical defeats that are inflicted upon them. Counterinsurgency, however, in the US military, again with some honorable exceptions, unfortunately has long been disdained as a quote-unquote lesser included contingency, unworthy of contemplation, much less serious study. And I see this even more so now reflected in the emerging quote-unquote who lost Iraq debate and blaming the Iraqis for this. This is something that Tom Ricks wrote about last week in the Washington Post, and I was sorry, he provided one quote that I gave him, but he didn't say the rest, and I said that there's certainly more than enough blame to go around, and there's certainly plenty of blame for the Iraqis. But before we begin blaming the Iraqis, we have to reflect on some of our most important mistakes. It was our policy that created an Iraqi military force from the beginning and completely neglected the police. The police, which of course are the foundation for the security and stability of any viable society, not least one countering an insurgency. We created an army, moreover, initially in our own image, an army that was orientated towards external threats, not towards the internal security of Iraq. We created an Iraqi National Intelligence Service that was modeled on the CIA and MI6, on intelligence services that focus outwardly against external threats, and similarly, completely neglected creating a police special branch or an internal security service that would be effective in getting information from the population and countering insurgency. We pushed police out the door after 3 weeks of training without body armor in unarmored pickup trucks with just 9mm pistols as their main weapon. And finally, we created no vetting system, no means of determining the allegiances, the pedigree, or the interests and affiliations of those we brought into either the military or to the police force. So, let me begin to wrap up. I think what all this does is beg the question, can a conventional military do counterinsurgency? And I have to say that the evidence to date is thin, if not lamentably and singularly depressing. So what do we do about this? And here I have to impart an important caveat. Unlike the gentleman sitting in the front row who are wearing uniforms, unlike my former student, Major Tavere, who's taught me as more perhaps than I taught him. I've never been a soldier. I've never been in the military. The one perhaps credential is, at least I've thought about this issue for a long time, and as Bob in his very kind introduction, I've also been studying insurgency for nearly 30 years. I spent time in Iraq as an advisor to Ambassador Bremer. I was an advisor to General Casey, and most recently an advisor to the Iraq Study Group. So even though I have none of the credentials of the people sitting in the first two front rows, at least this is something I've thought about. And in 2 or 3 minutes, what should we do about it? My conclusion is that unconventional or irregular warfare needs to be commanded and fought by unconventional warriors. This is not something that conventional military officers can effectively command and lead. With all due respect to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Pace, his remark the other day, I think, underscores the lack of understanding we have about counterinsurgency. He said, we may not be winning the war, but we're also not losing it. In countering insurgency, that's precisely the point. If you're not winning it, you're losing it. Because from the insurgents' point of view, this is ineluctably and fundamentally a war of attrition, just as TX described. They are trying to sap and wear down our political will. Here, on the other hand, this type of warfare, unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense and development, concepts that were once understood and studied in the 1960s and again in the 1980s, but then discarded, are core special operations missions. But as a good friend of mine who's a special forces officer explained to me when I complained to him about this, he said, the problem is special operations remains a minority voice, and I'm quoting him, within a largely conventional military. And here I think we see one of the key differences in this failure to understand unconventional warfare, which in special forces parlance means not hit-and-run, door-kicking commando attacks, but actually means training of indigenous foreign forces, embedded advisors, working, living, and mentoring indigenous forces. But there's also a lack of understanding in the capabilities that special operations forces can bring to these struggles. Even the distinction between black special operations forces and white special operations forces is lost on most.